Hi, everyone, and welcome to a special edition recording in the Alliance for Health Policy's 2020 Signature Series on Disruptors and Transformers. I'm Sarah Dash, I'm President and CEO of the Alliance for Health Policy, and for those who are new to us, welcome. We are a nonpartisan resource for the health policy community dedicated to advancing knowledge and understanding of health policy issues. The goal of this multi part virtual summit is to explore the short and long term impacts of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and its potential to significantly transform the healthcare system. Please join us throughout the week on social media using the hashtag AHP Summit 20 and ask us questions, engage with us after this event ends as we continue the conversation online. Please don't forget to join us tomorrow, July 23rd, for our two final events of the summit. First, our panel on using data to disrupt the spread of COVID 19 and prevent future pandemics at noon Eastern, and our second keynote address, a conversation on innovative research approaches to advance our understanding and treatment of COVID 19 at 2 p.m. Eastern. Finally, you can find recordings of previous sessions on our website at allhealthpolicy.org. So I'm really pleased today to be having a conversation with Jenny Bryant, Executive Vice President of Policy and Research for the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, to give us a bird's eye view of where things stand from the pharmaceutical industry's perspective. Nowhere really are the transformative and disruptive forces more evident right now than in the research and development space. And as we continue several more months into the pandemic, all eyes are really seem to be on the vaccine development pipeline and the treatment pipeline to help produce a safe and effective immunization to the novel coronavirus. So really pleased to be sitting down with Jenny to give us a snapshot of where things stand. Jenny currently leads PhRMA's policy and research department in the development and implementation of legislative, regulatory, political strategies in the federal healthcare landscape. She has had an impressive career with roles throughout the healthcare industry as well, and she holds her MBA from Harvard. So, Jenny, thanks for joining me today.
Sure. Happy to see you, Sarah.
Great to see you. So let's talk about this idea of COVID has seems like it's accelerated change kind of throughout the healthcare sector, whether we're talking about, just the rapid adoption of telemedicine. Certainly it's been a hugely disruptive force in many ways. But how are you seeing this in the research world, like in the R&D world? Are you seeing an acceleration of research efforts towards combating the pandemic?
We absolutely are seeing an enormous acceleration of research in this space. This feels like a really unprecedented time to me, I must say. Looking back to February, we just had no idea what type of year we'd be facing. And, now, several months later, our companies are really working 24/7 to try to develop new treatments, to treat the disease, but also develop a vaccine. And so there's been just an explosion of activity looking at sort of every possible path. So trying to repurpose existing medicines and go through like global libraries of compounds to see if compounds in their development pipeline could possibly be used, um, and sort of using a whole variety of techniques and platforms that have been developed over the last several decades in response to other diseases. So there's been more activity than it's easy to even describe, and happening really all at an incredible pace, because people recognize that this is just it's a moment in time when we all have to work together. So there's been an effort to kind of check the competition at the door and recognize that now is the time for sharing protocols, sharing data, working collaboratively with the government, with academia, with other companies. So it definitely feels like um, a new moment.
Yeah. And we've heard, like in the case of vaccine development in particular, that it can take 8 to 10 years to develop a vaccine, and that we're working on just an incredibly accelerated timeline because obviously nobody wants to stay, stuck with the stay at home for as long as we have, or as long as we may need to. So talk about that kind of um, that parallel processing almost of, about like how is the industry, how are the companies kind of responding to making that timeline shorter?
Yeah, so I mean I think you hit it when you talk about parallel processing, because traditionally, um, taking a new medicine to market takes a long time, and taking vaccines generally takes even longer. If you think about it, you're putting a vaccine into a healthy person. So you really have a lot of work to do to make certain that it can be safe and effective. And the goal here has been to maintain those same safety and effectiveness standards, but try to achieve the process by moving steps in parallel rather than in sequence. And so that requires a lot of collaboration between all the various different players. And there are government efforts like Operation Warp Speed that are trying to make certain that while there are like 150 vaccine um, projects underway globally, that we pick those that are most promising and make sure that they have access to the healthy volunteers for trials. And so there's coordination around that, and coordination around trying to make sure that the protocols are optimized so they can happen really quickly, to move the process forward. And there also needs to be coordination and collaboration around scaling up of manufacturing, because what you see is as the manufacturers are committing to manufacturing at risk, which means that they are actually producing vaccines now without knowing whether they will be effective. If you think about that, millions of doses that they're getting ready to produce without even having finished the testing to know. And they're talking about sharing that capacity, so that if a manufacturer's vaccine is not effective, they may make that capacity available to another manufacturer whose vaccine is effective. And all of this needs to be facilitated with the various government agencies who are also planning for how do we scale up and get ready to vaccinate millions of people in the US, tens of millions of people,
Yeah.
you know, using a system of both public and private providers. So it's complicated, and there are a lot of moving parts, which is why there's just a level of collaboration we haven't seen in the past.
Yeah, definitely. And that willingness to kind of assume the risk of making some doses, and if it ends up not working, being willing to destroy those and start over, right? Start over fresh. Definitely, definitely an unprecedented time. Do you think we learned from the SARS or the Ebola experiences? I mean, even though those didn't really, impact on U.S. soil as much, do you think that the
Yeah,
infrastructure was kind of better because of lessons learned from those?
I do. I mean, I think that the industry is kind of remarkably positioned to succeed. Um, we have deep scientific expertise based on years of working with Ebola, with MERS, with hepatitis C, with HIV. So actually, there's a lot of experience to draw on, which is why they can move as quickly as we can. And there's also been investment in new types of technology which can speed the process of decoding the virus, speed the process of screening multiple compounds, and um, also new technologies that can boost the effectiveness of vaccines, so that there's a lot of there's been a lot of investment, and that's one of the features of the U.S. system, is that it does kind of create. We have the vibrant capital markets that creates incentives for investment, and so we have a lot of investment, we have a lot of expertise, and we have the ability to manufacture at scale and distribute at scale. So I think that I think we're actually well positioned to succeed. So I'm optimistic um, that we will actually, find our way through this tunnel here, and get back to the lives we're used to living in the community. Uh, but there's a lot of work still underway to make sure that can happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and maybe, just kind of sticking on the vaccine front, maybe we can talk a little bit about, you know, once we get to that day, and we'll be optimistic here and say, once we get to that day that there is a safe, effective vaccine, ready to go, talk a little bit about kind of how that becomes accessible to the population.
So, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion and planning for that. And I think you see efforts already by many of the companies who have made quite clear that they recognize this is not business as usual. And they have humanitarian intentions here to make certain that everyone is who needs the vaccine can get it at an affordable price. I'd also say the government has contracted for millions and millions of doses, and so um, uh, honestly, I think I spent a lot of my time worrying about affordability, but I, candidly much more worried about affordability of
Mm,
non-COVID COVID vaccines and treatments in the future than I am about the vaccines, because I think that we are going to have infrastructure in place to make sure that the vaccines are available to people. But between the contracted purchases and the efforts, Congress has made sure that patients won't have to have cost sharing for vaccines. I think, and the conversations that are happening between manufacturers and health plans, I think that there's good reason to be to not worry about affordability of the vaccines here.
early on in the pandemic, and even now we're sort of talking about supply chains. You mentioned distribution, the global distribution, and how the sector has to get medicines from point A to point B, and kind of like rely on a global supply chain. There have been some disruptions in that supply chain, like we've heard, with respect to PPE, with respect to maybe certain medicines. But from your perspective, like how bad have the global supply chain issues been? What are things that need to be done, if anything, kind of going into the future to make sure we have that reliable supply chain for medicine?
Well, the first thing I think I'd say is that all this new work around COVID is happening on top of maintaining the existing supply of medicines that patients need for a whole host of conditions, and that largely that's been able to continue without disruptions, which is in itself a remarkable feat. And I think that there's some misperceptions about the supply chain, um, and people don't recognize that, in fact, one of the ways that our supply chain is so resilient and effective is because it is globally distributed. So we do need to avoid over reliance on any one country, but generally companies already have plans for redundancy and plans to manage shortages and to manage emergencies. If there's a hurricane, they need to be able to move to a different facility and pull
Mm,
supply from different places. So uh, in fact, the supply chain is actually very resilient. And so it, that said, it does make sense for us to be thinking about how to build incentives for American manufacturing and to have America take even more of a leadership role in manufacturing. And as new medicines come aboard with more sophisticated manufacturing techniques, we're actually well positioned, I think, to build that type of advanced manufacturing base here, even more in the US. And so we can look at incentives to do that. I think that the risk, though, is that people will sort of in an effort to say we want everything made here, it could lead to disruptive changes, like right at a moment when frankly we can't afford that, and we need to be
mhm.
maintaining a continuous supply and working carefully to make sure that we don't sort of trigger reactions abroad too. Like what we need to be avoiding is sort of efforts to say, like export bans, export restrictions, all these kinds of efforts to force um, localized production and sort of like protect supply actually have many counter, unintended effects
Hmm.
that really work against all of us. So now's kind of a time for thoughtful collaboration and cooperation around the supply chain and working on incentives to strengthen it over the long run, but not to try to impose mandates that aren't going to be workable and that will backfire.
Thanks. So one last question, just, we're obviously heavily in the middle of this pandemic, but as we think about, preparing for the future, you mentioned even hurricane season, we know flu season's coming up. We know, unfortunately, there probably will be another pandemic at some point, right? Like, what are some of your thoughts about what's top of mind for you as we prepare, use this moment to tackle this pandemic and then prepare for the future as well?
Well, I think what's really top of mind for me is that this moment is instructive and it shows the degree to which our system is one where manufacturers and academic researchers and government agencies are all working together in a moment of crisis. And um, it's one of the things that's kind of most wonderful about the US system is that we have a framework that allows that collaboration to happen, and it drives the innovation we see in this country. And that has led to really astounding progress in the last decade. I mean, if you just look at I think last year, 56 new medicines approved, right? Really incredible at a time when medicine prices were decelerating. And it comes from this system that is kind of being highlighted in COVID of enormous collaboration. And what's top of mind for me is that people have a misperception that somehow the government provides all the funding, the manufacturers then take that, flip a switch, and make all the money. And that's actually really not true. The government research leads to clues that then manufacturers pour billions of dollars into testing, and at the end of it, you have a medicine. And there are all these different players, and they all play a part. And in fact, we also have a great system that allows academic researchers to share in the fruits of that effort through royalties, et cetera. And that system works. And you're seeing it work here now during COVID. And what's top of mind for me is that we need to protect and sustain that system so that we're ready for the next pandemic and that we can continue to be generating new medicines of the kinds that we've been generating. And there's just enormous potential in our pipeline. So we're at this moment when we can make decisions about how we want to move forward. And I do see a discussion that's becoming incredibly polarized where a lot of folks are sort of saying, well, the system we have doesn't work. We should throw it out and try a lot more top-down,
Mm.
centralized decision-making, centralized price setting, et cetera. And it's ironic because it's happening at a moment during COVID when I think actually you see the results of the system we do have here actually bearing fruit. And you see such rapid progress. And you see us in a position where we're able to make progress so much faster than we were, say, for SARS when we had that
Mm.
pandemic.
Yeah. Well,
Outbreak.
thank you, and we look forward to seeing, the results of that progress. And I know, we'll be following it closely, and we really appreciate all of the work that is happening, as you said, 24/7 to get us that vaccine and get us those therapies. So, I think, that is unfortunately all the time we have, but I think that's a good place to end on. Jenny, it's been great speaking with you and getting, again, a little bit of a taste of, kind of where things stand. We really look forward to, again, to seeing where things go, and appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks. You too. Bye.